Hello and welcome to the Tudor Her Story. Today I am discussing Queen Elizabeth of York with Clemmie Bennett. Clemmie is the author of The Apple and the Tree, a time-travelling novel taking place at the court of Henry VIII. She's been interested in history since childhood and developed a fascination for the Tudors when she moved to England in 2016. She is now writing her second novel and has plenty of ideas for the next few ones. Let's get into today's chat. Welcome back to the podcast, Clemmie. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Fine, thank you. Excited for our chat tonight. We're discussing Elizabeth of York, and I can't wait for you to tell us more about her.
Same. Thank you for having me.
So, before we get on to Elizabeth, I was wondering if we could discuss a little bit about yourself first, as obviously it's been a while since you were last on the podcast. So, when did you become interested in history and more specifically Tudor history?
Well, I was always interested in history. I'm not sure why. It's always fascinated me. I think I'm someone with some sort of golden age syndrome. The past is so much better and more interesting than the present. And well, my brain knows it's not necessarily true, especially in terms of, women's rights. But I don't know, my heart is obsessed with the past. And I've always loved studying it, finding out more about it. I mean, it shaped who we are now and how we operate as a society. So for me, it's fascinating. And in terms of Tudor history, well, I think I told you privately before, but it was the show The Tudors. It's a very dramatic show, very inaccurate, and sometimes frustratingly so. But it just drew me in. It made me start researching the real people behind the characters, and to be honest, I've never really stopped. So here we are.
I mean, I love Tudor history, and that's how I got into the Tudors as well. It's the
There you go.
series. I mean, I've
And
started
we're not ashamed of it.
No, I'm not ashamed. I have started rewatching it, and there's a portrait of Richard III in the background.
Oh
And
God.
I went, pause. What is that?
Oh my goodness. I need to do a rewatch, like
Watch
a
the
TikTok live.
portraits. Just watch the portraits. Be like, why are you there? Seriously.
Oh, this is wonderful.
Have
Well,
you?
we'll talk about Richard today, so.
No, Richard's in the closet for today. Have you got a favourite Tudor figure that you love talking about all the time?
Oh, Catherine of Aragon,
Mm.
definitely. She's my go-to queen, but I also really love Elizabeth of York, and that is why today we're going to stick with Elizabeth. And Elizabeth absolutely adored Catherine of Aragon, so everyone's happy here.
So you have actually published a book. I think was it 2 years ago now? Am I 2 years? 3 years?
Yep.
The Apple and the Tree, and it's a time-traveling historical novel. Would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about your fabulous book?
Oh, thank you. Yes, so I published it in 2023 on Henry VIII's birthday, actually. And it is a time traveling novel, which ultimately creates an alternate history. The main character is a girl like you and me, brought up in the 21st century, and she inherits a ring from her grandmother. And that ring turns out to be a time portal, and Ella, the character, ends up right in the middle of Eltham Palace in 1510. And usually, when I'm asked to sum up the core story in just one sentence, it's a question, and it is, if you could change history, should you?
Mm. Yes, that was the question in that novel.
Hmm.
Are we getting a sequel soon?
We are getting a sequel this year, 2025. It is still in the works. It's going somewhere. It will be released this year. My bill-paying job is always getting in the way, but we're getting there. It will be released this year.
Can't wait, honestly. You left me on a cliffhanger, and you know you did.
Sorry.
On to our main lady, Elizabeth. When was Elizabeth born and who were her parents?
So Elizabeth of York was born at the Palace of Westminster on the 11th of February, 1466, and she was the eldest child of the Yorkist King Edward IV and his, let's say, somewhat now to just to birth. In the 15th century, England was going through the Wars of the Roses, which back then was actually known as the Cousins' War because it was literally just a bunch of cousins killing each other for the throne. Elizabeth's father, King Edward IV, was the son of Richard, Duke of York, so Yorkist king. The opposite side was the Lancastrian side. Edward, to end up on the throne, Edward had deposed his cousin, King Henry VI, who was the great grandson of John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. So that's where Yorkists and Lancastrian sides come from. So Elizabeth was born, as we said, in 1466, right in the middle of a civil war, and her side was chosen for her at birth. She was a Yorkist.
Yeah, obviously, this period in history is so well known and so turbulent. And obviously, at this point, it seems Edward is somewhat secure on his throne. Not massively, but he's not completely terrified yet. And obviously, what
Not yet.
he's not terrified yet. What kind of life would this have been for Elizabeth with the tension when her father goes abroad briefly as well, when Warwick rebels?
Well, her childhood had, I would say her life, her childhood, early teens were mostly very comfortable, and dare I say happy, excluding, as you mentioned, that one-ish period during which her father was in exile. So I'm just going to go back to it and again give some context because, so very sadly, there's a lot about Elizabeth and her thoughts that we just don't know. And so we have to think about the whole context to try to imagine what her life was. And the reality is that when she was 3 years old, so in 1469, she was briefly betrothed to George Neville. And it was very quickly called off when George's father, John Neville, supported the rebellion against Edward IV, so Elizabeth's father. And that rebellion was actually led by Elizabeth's uncle, George, Duke of Clarence, and the Earl of Warwick. Edward was sadly defeated, briefly held prisoner. Thankfully, he escaped and he fled the country. And so Henry VI was reinstated on the throne. Again, thankfully, Edward managed to win his throne back in 1471. And so during that brief time that Edward was in exile, Elizabeth was with her mother and her two younger sisters in sanctuary in Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth Woodville had taken her three children there for safety, and she was heavily pregnant. And this is actually where she gave birth to Edward, the future Edward V. And as a side note, I happened to have been so lucky to visit these few rooms. They're typically not open to the public. But I was a bit cheeky and I asked directly the Dean of Westminster, and he was so kind to open the doors to me. And it's very powerful. It's a powerful visit. Anyway, this clearly must have been a very, very scary time for Elizabeth. She was quite young. She was like around 4 or 5 years old, but she was still old enough to understand that something was not quite right. and that her father was gone, that her mother was understandably very anxious about their safety, really. So this would have been quite a dark period of time, quite a dark period of Elizabeth's childhood. And then later on, when she was, I think, yeah, when she was 9 years old, and she was fully back in in the security and the warmth of her father's reign, once Edward was back on the throne, Elizabeth, quite a lot of people don't know that, but she was actually betrothed to the French Dauphin, so the son and heir to the King of France. Back then, the king was Louis the 11th. And this lasted for 7 years. So between the age of 9 and 16, so quite very important years, um, she was betrothed to the heir to the throne of France. She was she was thought to be the next Queen of France. So it's quite likely that she would have learned as well everything that was appropriate for a future Queen of France to learn. So I think that would have shaped her childhood quite drastically as well. And then Louis the XI, mostly due to politics, broke the betrothal, and the Dauphin went on to marry Anne of Brittany instead.
Was Elizabeth have been brought up with a bit of an education? If she was thought to be going to France, was she kind of being brought up to be a French princess?
As a French princess, I'm not sure. I think it would have definitely have an influence on her education. But above anything else, as a princess of the blood of the 15th century, Elizabeth would have learned, needlework and pursuits considered appropriate for girls, like dancing and singing, playing musical instruments, even the art of conversing and running a household, that sort of thing. But what I find really interesting as well is that we know that Elizabeth could read and write, and that she actually loved books. We have a letter that survived from Elizabeth written to the Queen of Castile. So we know she could write, we know she could read, we know she loved books. She became the patron of William Caxton actually during her reign, and William Caxton went on to introduce the printing of books in England. So that's quite something. And there's this very cute anecdote that her handwriting and her son's handwriting, so the future Henry VIII, their handwritings are very similar. So it's highly likely that she actually took the time to teach him to read and write, um, which is amazing, I think, to imagine a medieval queen, sitting down with her young son and teaching him to write his letters. I always love to say that. It's just adorable.
No, it's a really tender moment because I think it shows what kind of a bit of an insight into Elizabeth and what kind of person she should have been as well.
Absolutely. And the time that she actually took to be a mother, not just a queen, but a mother as well.
Exactly. Was Elizabeth close with her parents or siblings?
It appears so. Yeah. Elizabeth had nine younger siblings, which is a lot. And I think pretty sure only two of them did not make it past infancy, which was quite lucky back then. It was a quite a good result to have only two early deaths. And it's such a sad thing to say, but it was the reality. And yeah, they all appeared to be close. Edward IV was known to be a loving and doting father. He adored his children. And something that's great as well is that, unlike his grandson, Henry VIII, he never put any pressure on his wife, or at least it's not recorded, um, to have a male heir. Only he finally got his male heir as his, it was the fourth child's fourth pregnancy, but there was never any pressure, any resentment. And the first three girls, so including Elizabeth, who was the first one, were very much loved by their father and by their mother as well. Elizabeth was quite present in their life as well. And I do believe that, especially for Elizabeth, Mary and Cecily, so Mary and Cecily were her two younger sisters that spent that time in sanctuary with Elizabeth and their mother. I do think that it helped bonding, there's
Mm.
some sort of trauma bonding, if you please. I do think that they were especially close at the four of them.
No, I agree. I think obviously the events of 1483 were a bit traumatic, and I think these women had to put a plan together almost how to get through this. How do you get through that? You know, in 1483, Edward the Fourth suddenly dies in April, and Elizabeth's younger brother becomes King of England, and things go a bit awry, as we know, to say the
That's one way of
least.
putting it.
They go a bit awry. Where was Elizabeth when her father died?
So the thing is, Edward's death was super unexpected. He had fought so many battles. Somehow it seems that he just caught a cold while fishing and died of pneumonia. And so, as you said, it was in 1483. Elizabeth was 17, and it's very likely that she was in one of her father's palaces with her siblings. Of course, not with her brother Edward, who was the heir. He was Prince of Wales, and as such, he was in Ludlow Castle. But she was with the rest of her siblings in one of the palaces. I do not think it is recorded which one it was at that time, though.
Do we know kind of what happens to Elizabeth in the next few weeks when Richard declares himself protector and Elizabeth Woodville goes into sanctuary with her children?
Yeah, so again, to talk about Elizabeth, then we have to talk about the wider context. And as you said, so Edward IV on his deathbed, he gave custody of his son Edward to his brother Richard. And he appears that he named Richard as regent, protector of the kingdom, until young Edward came of age, of course. And Elizabeth Woodville did not seem to have been too happy about it. She had expected her own brother, Anthony Woodville, to be given custody of Edward, families and in-laws. But as Edward V, so the young Edward, as he was traveling back from Ludlow to London to be crowned king, his uncle Richard, back then it was Richard of Gloucester, he intercepted him for his so-called safety and protection and sent him to the Tower of London. Back then, the Tower of London did not have that sordid reputation that it later developed. It was a royal residence. Monarchs were usually sleeping there the day before the coronation. So it was not terribly unusual for Edward to be sent there. What was very unusual, though, was for Richard to arrest Edward's uncle, Anthony Woodville, and also his half-brother, Richard Grey. And both men were actually executed. So understandably, very understandably, Elizabeth Woodville got really scared. She took all her daughters, including Elizabeth of York. She also took her other son, Richard, and she took them all to Westminster Abbey, back in sanctuary for their safety. And so for Elizabeth, so Elizabeth of York, after all these years, she was back in sanctuary, and this time she was definitely old enough to understand what was happening, and it must have been absolutely traumatizing, especially considering that she was the eldest girl, and we all know that whatever the century eldest girls always have that layer of pressure. Um, but for Elizabeth, her father was dead. Her uncle had executed her half brother and her other uncle. Yeah, she was old enough to understand that this situation was one, out of control, and two, terrifying. Then Elizabeth Woodville was forced to release little Richard out of sanctuary so he could keep company to his brother Edward in a tower. And here I'm using air quotes, keeping company to Edward. Elizabeth agreed, but very reluctantly. And I think that she knew that something wasn't right, but she definitely didn't know that she would never get to see her son again. And Elizabeth of York as well didn't know that she would never get to see her two brothers ever again. And then for Elizabeth, it changed further in June of that year. So we're still in 1483. And her parents' marriage was declared invalid due to the sudden and very convenient claim from Richard that Edward IV had already been married to a lady called Lady Eleanor Butler when he married Elizabeth Woodville. Now, of course, both Edward and Eleanor were dead and could not defend themselves. Again, very convenient. It may have been true. Edward IV was a great king, but he had his flaws and he had his dark side. So it may have been true. And we'll just never know for sure. And that's very frustrating. Anyway, whether it was true or not, Parliament issued a bill, like a royal title bill. It's a titulus regis. I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly. But effectively, the bill made Edward and Elizabeth children illegitimate. So that includes Elizabeth of York. The effect was to bar them from inheriting the throne. They were just simply out of the succession. So after 17 years of being a princess of the blood, the daughter of a king and a queen, Elizabeth was just no longer who she had always been. So it must have been quite a bitter pill to swallow, quite an adjustment as well. And I can't help but think and wonder what she thought about it all because it's just not recorded. We don't know if Elizabeth ever questioned her parents' marriage, if she believed what was said about her father. We just don't know. And we also don't know what Elizabeth thought about the fate of her brothers, because a month later, in July 1483, Richard was crowned as Richard III, and his nephews, so Elizabeth's brothers, Edward and Richard, were just never seen again. And we're not going to talk about the mystery of the Princes of the Tower because otherwise we'll be there in 3 hours and it's just a completely different podcast. But quite quickly, some believe that the princes somehow escaped and survived. Others believe that they were murdered. The people who believe they were murdered don't agree on who ordered the murder. So it was a complete mess. It was a hot mess 500 years ago, and it still is one. And what really bothers me, besides the fact that, two children disappeared, is that we don't know what Elizabeth thought about it. There's just no record of it. Even in later years, when she was on the throne herself, she never really talked about it. So it's just, we don't know.
No, I mean, I'm sure we can imagine what she must have felt or what she was going through, but we haven't got it, as you say, written on paper. We haven't got documented sources. But it must have been an extremely stressful time because obviously, as you say, what a big adjustment. Your father's died, your family members are being executed here, there, and everywhere, and you've just been made illegitimate as well. Mental. When Richard becomes king, does Elizabeth attend court?
Well, Not at first. When Richard III was crowned, Elizabeth and her sisters were still in Westminster Abbey in sanctuary, and they only left the following year I think it was in March 1484, and then they returned to court. Now, historians disagree on the reason why, on the reason behind it. It may be because Elizabeth Woodville was somehow reconciled with Richard and believed him to be innocent of the disappearance of her sons, or maybe that she was in the know that her sons were alive and had just, escaped and were abroad. I find it very unlikely. What is more likely is that Elizabeth Woodville had no other choice. She knew that she had to secure her daughter's futures, and her daughters had to find a husband. They could not remain in sanctuary forever. And also, now that the boys were presumed dead, and due to the girls' very gender, they were no real threat to Richard. And so Elizabeth probably thought that they would be safe enough at court. Again, we don't exactly know. What we do know is that Richard III, publicly, and I think this is hilarious, it's sad and hilarious, but he publicly swore that he would not hurt any of the girls and he would not imprison them in the Tower or any other prison. Like, I swear, it's fine. You can release them and nothing's going to happen to them. So just the fact that he had to do that to me speaks volume. But anyway, Elizabeth goes to court, and she appears to have been well treated at court. She was even seen twinning with Queen Anne in terms of clothing, in terms of gowns, which was it was not something that was ever supposed to happen. No one was supposed to be twinning with the Queen, but it was the reality there. So she was really well treated. She had a good, she was present at court. She doesn't seem to have been in any kind of danger. The only thing, the only danger was mostly about the rumors, because very quickly rumors started to rise that Richard III wanted to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. He was married to Queen Anne, so Anne Neville, but their only child, Edward, had died in April the previous year, or no, that year. So he had just died, like Prince Edward. And Anne's health was also not the best. So it was quite clear that to have a legitimate son, a legitimate heir, Richard would have to remarry. But even in the 15th century, for an uncle to marry his niece, it was a big no, even in the 15th century. So Richard had to publicly deny the rumors, just to publicly say, no, I'm not going to marry my niece. And when Queen Anne died just a few months later, Richard actually sent Elizabeth away from court. He sent her to Sheriff Hutton Castle, that's in Yorkshire, and he also entered some negotiations with the Kingdom of Portugal. So he was negotiating with King John II of Portugal for Richard to marry John's sister Joan, and for Elizabeth to marry their cousin, so the king's cousin, Manuel. So he was very clear. He wanted to make it very clear that no, he was not going to marry his niece.
I mean, obviously, we don't have a lot, as you say, we only have rumours about whether Richard was going to try and marry his niece or not. And obviously, we know he repudiates this. He's like, no, 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 of course not. I'd never marry my niece. No, 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 it's not me. It's not me. Why?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Me? I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't marry my niece. But obviously, 1485, we're starting to hear some other rumours as well about a certain Tudor across the sea planning a little revolt to come to England. And he does land in August 1485. And Spoiler alert, he kills Richard. No, someone else kills Richard at the battle. Right. Henry might have not actually done it himself. Someone else might have done it. Um, where is Elizabeth when the Battle of or do we know where Elizabeth is at the battle when the Battle of Bosworth happens?
So highly likely she is in Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire. So she's well away from the battle, well away from London, when Henry Tudor and Richard III fight in Bosworth, as you said, in August 1485. And basically, when they decide the future of England, but also the future of Elizabeth. Because if Richard had won and kept his crown, it's quite likely that the negotiations with the Portugal crown would have continued. It's possible that Elizabeth would have become Queen of Portugal when Manuel actually became king. But hey, as we know, Henry Tudor won the crown, and it decided a very different future for Elizabeth. Now, I do realize that we haven't really talked about Henry Tudor before, so is that okay if I just give a quick background on Henry? Yeah.
Of course, of
Thanks.
course.
So in the Cousins' Wars between York and Lancaster, Henry was on the Lancaster side. He was the half-nephew of Henry VI, as his father, Edmund Tudor, was the younger half-brother of Henry VI. And Henry himself was also a descendant of John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's children. However, he was descended from the Beaufort children, the Beaufort line. John of Gaunt had legitimate children with his legitimate wives, but he also had four illegitimate children with his mistress, Catherine Swynford. And John and Catherine eventually married. I think Catherine Swynford was incredible, by the way. That's just quick side note. Wonderful woman. They eventually married, and their children were legitimized. So that was during the reign of Richard II. But Richard's successor and, well, let's say usurper, Henry IV, barred the Beaufort children and their descendants from ever inheriting the throne. So that that means that Henry's claim to the throne was weak, especially when you consider that his English royal drops of blood came from his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, and not even his father. So his claim was weak, but still, because of his lineage, he spent most of his life in exile for his own security. And his mother, so Lady Margaret Beaufort, she really, really worked like tirelessly to bring him back to England, back to her side and to do so safely. And how we get to Elizabeth is that we have a source from Polydore Virgil, which says that Margaret Beaufort, so Henry's mum, and Elizabeth Woodville, Elizabeth's mother, they hatched a plan to marry their children, which would essentially boost Henry's claim to the throne and bring him the support that he needed to overthrow Richard III. And way before Bosworth, actually, in December 1483, so that's like a year and a half before Bosworth, Henry actually publicly vowed to marry Elizabeth and make her his queen. And this clearly worked because it gave him all the support, so the financial support, the political support, the military support that he needed to invade England, defeat Richard, and, well, become king. And yeah, it worked.
Well done, Henry.
Well done, Margaret.
And Margaret. Do we know when Henry and Elizabeth met for the first time officially? Because obviously they had to meet before they got married.
Well, it's not entirely sure when or where. It's just not recorded. what we can say with, pretty clear certainty is that they met after Bosworth, so after August 1485. But exactly when or where, we don't really know. It's very likely that meeting happened in one of the houses of Lady Margaret Beaufort. Again, there's no record of it.
Mm. When did Elizabeth and Henry marry?
They married on the 18th of January, 1486. And that's interesting because it is 5 months into Henry VII's reign, which seems like an awfully long time for him to wait. Well, of course, Henry had to have the Titulus Regis cancelled to, re-legitimize Elizabeth and his siblings. And they also have they also needed to have a papal dispensation to be able to marry because Henry and Elizabeth were both descended from Edward III, so they were related. But what is very clear is that those 5 months, it was Henry's way to make sure that everyone understood that he was king because of Bosworth, not because of Elizabeth. He wanted everyone to know that he had won the crown on the battlefield, fair and square, and not only because he had married a Yorkist princess. And yeah, I think the dates are quite significant, really, because Henry himself was crowned in October 1485, 3 months before he married Elizabeth. So he was crowned first, and then he married her. And Elizabeth herself, she was only crowned in November 1487, and that's a year after she had given birth to Henry's first son, so son and heir, Prince Arthur. And you have to see it. I mean, I know I do, but I can't help seeing that as Henry's way of saying, well, you want to be queen, you want to be crowned queen? Okay, give me a son first, give me an heir, and start building my dynasty and my legacy. And well, that's what Elizabeth did. She gave him a male heir. She ended up giving him more. So yeah, well done, Elizabeth.
What sort of relationship did Henry and Elizabeth have? Was it a happy one?
So short answer is yes. Longer answer is that it definitely started as a political match. It was an arranged marriage, and well, to be honest, back then, especially for royalty and nobility, it was the norm. Love matches were very rare. And there's, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but there's no record of what Henry or Elizabeth felt about marrying each other. But ultimately, the fact that they were political enemies didn't actually make them personal enemies. We just don't know what they felt about it. It was just a way to end the Wars of the Roses. For Henry, it was his ticket to be king. For Elizabeth, it was also to become queen and also about doing what her mother wanted her to do. Now, was it hard for her to marry the man who had killed her uncle? Probably. But then did she think that this very uncle had killed her brothers? It's possible as also. So we just don't know their state of mind. But what we do know is that they were married for 17 years until Elizabeth's death. And during these 17 years, they were never parted for very long. And when they were actually sending each other cute gifts and cute letters. And it's oddly modern and it's quite adorable as well. And there's no record whatsoever, not even rumors or anything like this, that Henry VII ever took a mistress, which was very it was not the norm. The norm was to take a mistress. For example, Edward IV absolutely adored his wife, Elizabeth Woodville. but he still had a very long string of mistresses in his bed. So for Henry the Seventh to not take a mistress, it was not the norm. Now, there will be people who will tell you that Henry the Seventh perhaps was very discreet, or that he didn't do that because he wanted to avoid having, illegitimate children that would jeopardize the safety of his legitimate children and the descendants on the throne. But what is more likely, what is really, really likely, is that he just never took a mistress, just never in 17 years. And then when their first son, Arthur, died in 1502, we have the record of their reaction, of Henry and Elizabeth's reaction. And you're going to tell me what you think, but to me, it's not just the reaction of a couple liking each other and making the most of an arranged marriage. Like Henry the Seventh was told, but his first reaction, he was told of his son's death, and his first reaction was to send for Elizabeth so they could take the news together as parents and as a couple. And Elizabeth came and she stayed strong in the room for Henry. I think she knew that he had lost a son, but mostly he had lost his heir. And she reassured him that they still had Henry, so the future Henry VIII. She also told him that they were still young enough to have another son. She made him feel better. She stayed really, really strong through her grief. And only once he was reassured a little bit, she went back to her chambers, and there she completely fell apart. She completely fell apart. And she was actually crying so much that her woman sent for Henry, they sent for the king, who literally dropped everything and rushed back to his wife's side. And then he told her the exact same thing. We still have Henry, we're still young enough, we can have another son, it's going to be okay. And to me, this is mutual love and respect. So I think that was the foundation of their marriage, of their relationship, love and respect.
No, I completely agree. I think that moment you just talked about, I think shows that they had a close bond for the time, especially when it's always political arrangements. What type of, do we know what type of Queen Elizabeth
Yeah.
was? Was she a typical 15th slash early 16th century queen?
Well, when you picture the perfect medieval queen, the perfect 15th century queen, you imagine Elizabeth, basically.
Oh,
On the practical side, she had royal blood, she had impeccable linen. I mean, she gave her husband 7 children, including 3 boys. And she was very beautiful. She was, blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin, and it was the ideal of beauty back then. And it sounds a bit shallow, but appearances were very important back then for the king and queen, for the royal family. So yeah, she fit everything. But then also on the personality side, she was exactly what a queen should be back then. She was very sweet and kind, very discreet, very supportive of Henry, very supportive of her husband. And to be honest, she had grown up learning court etiquette from, her mother and her father. She knew exactly how to behave in an English court. Sometimes, if a king of England marries a foreign princess, perhaps, the upbringing is different. I'm thinking about Margaret of Anjou marrying King Henry VI, and her upbringing in France was clearly very different to what the expectations were for her in England. But it didn't apply to Elizabeth. She knew exactly what to do and what to say, what not to do, like at all times. But she was also a real people person. like her father Edward IV. They had the common touch, they were close to the people, and this was something that Henry VII, bless his heart, really lacked. Um, Elizabeth was also really pious, she was really charitable. In short, she was just the perfect Catholic queen consort. And there is literally nothing that can be said in a negative way against her behavior during her queenship. And to be honest, this is probably why there is so much that we don't know about Elizabeth. I feel like had she been more of a rebel, people would have written about her more. But because of her perfect behavior, because of this ideal personality for queenship, she has been quite overlooked by history.
No, I agree. I think obviously you've touched upon about how much of a good queen she was and how she was the perfect role model, and she learned court etiquette from a young age. But because she hadn't, we only really talk about it or remember it because her brothers went missing in the tower. Like if we go, oh yeah, something impactful in her life, her brothers went missing and her uncle might have killed them. But it's not actually her herself or her achievements, it's someone connected to her. Like we remember her son more than we remember her or we remember her husband.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she was the daughter of a king, the wife of a king, the sister of a king, but she was so much more as well. I think this is what's difficult with the time period, 15th century, even 16th century, because there's so much that we don't know about incredible women, and it's quite difficult because again, we've been talking about her for a while now, and the key points of her life, we still don't know what she thought, what she would have wanted to do about it. That, it's hard to give her a voice because I don't think she ever had one.
No, I agree. I think she either didn't give her opinions. I sometimes think, was she too careful of her own words because she's seen how it's gone for others, or are they just simply not recorded? And obviously we don't know because we're not there.
Yeah, we don't know, but I do think she would have kept her own counsel. She would have kept her opinions to herself. I think when you grow up in the Civil War, and also when you grow up at the court of England, and you see your family members being executed, as you said earlier, left and right, you learn really, really early and really quickly to be, yeah, to keep your own counsel and to be discreet and to not trust anyone.
In the early 1500s, as you mentioned earlier, that Arthur, her eldest son, suddenly dies. But before that, he married the Spanish Infanta, Catherine of Aragon, and they went off to Ludlow, and that's where they held their court while they were married. Sadly, 6 months later, he passes away, and you touched on the tender moment when Elizabeth and Henry found out what had happened to Arthur. What were the next few months like for Elizabeth? Did she get pregnant again? Was she at his funeral?
But it was not customary for the so she wasn't, and she's death. She made good on her promise that they were, Henry and Elizabeth were young enough to have another son. And it seems like she was not supposed to give birth in the Tower of London like she did. But I guess the baby arrived a bit early and she was on the Thames on her way to one of the royal palaces and had to stop last minute, like, oh my God, the baby's coming. The closest palace was the Tower of London, and this is where she gave birth to 1803. The girl was named Catherine in honor of Catherine of Aragon, her daughter-in-law. And very sadly, Elizabeth fell ill with childbed fever or prepubertal fever. It's such a hard word to say. Elizabeth's pregnancy had been difficult, very difficult already. Unfortunately, it ended even more badly. Elizabeth died on the 11th of February, which was also her 37th birthday, which is a special kind of bad luck, I think, to die on your own birthday. And yeah, sadly as well, the baby died as well, either just before Elizabeth or just after. The exact date is not actually recorded. So there's that possibility that it died on the same day as well, which is especially heartbreaking. But yeah, both mother and daughter died.
I mean, I think it's just so sad. It sounds like it was a traumatic birth, and she was only 37 as well. It was like it was her birthday, and she obviously had left behind Henry, Henry VIII. I think Margaret was being prepared to go to Scotland, her eldest daughter, and obviously young Mary's only about 8 or 7. She's quite young at this point. So she's leaving a lot
Mm.
behind. But obviously it's sad that the baby dies as well. So all of that, you know, we're still young, we can have another child, and it doesn't survive. I just think it's just so sad.
Mm. No, definitely. They tried. They really tried. And I did read somewhere, and I think I want to dive into it a little bit more, that Elizabeth's pregnancies were more and more difficult. But with each pregnancy, it got more difficult. And she was well aware that the next pregnancy would be especially difficult. But still, she promised her husband that she could give him another son. She had given him three. Arthur obviously had just died. Henry was, Henry. And she had given him Edmund, but sadly Edmund had died in infancy or in toddlerhood, perhaps. Edmund had died quite young, but she had told her husband that she would give him another son, and she tried. And I think that ultimately, it sounds a bit silly, but she died doing her duty as queen and her duty as 15th century wife. It, yeah, she died in the line of duty.
No, I think you're right, because that was her role, and I'm saying that in air quotes,
Yeah.
that's what was expected of her. But I have heard about what you said about each pregnancy she had got more and more harder. I have read that somewhere,
Mm.
and I can't think where I've read it, but I do think it sounds plausible. Whatever condition they said it was, definitely sounds like Elizabeth had that.
Mm. No, definitely. And I think it was taking a toll on her body more and more. But
Do
I will dig it a bit deeper.
do we know what Elizabeth's funeral was like?
It was quite something. No, but more seriously, um, Henry VII was utterly devastated in public, and Elizabeth died. He was beside himself. Beside himself, he grieved loudly. He really, really grieved, and as such, he spent a literal fortune on Elizabeth's funeral. He spent about £3,000, which today would be about £2 million. And to give some sort of comparison, he spent £600 on the funeral of his son. and really like much beloved heir Arthur just the previous year. So that we had like £600, and then suddenly we've got 3,000. Um, Elizabeth, her remains spent about 10 days. Yeah, 10 days lying in state in the Tower of London. And then there was this procession to Westminster Abbey, which is exactly the same route that a monarch usually took on their coronation day, from the Tower to Westminster Abbey. And the funeral procession was quite impressive. Elizabeth's coffin, there was this effigy of Elizabeth on top of it, and the effigy had a crown and scepter. The whole thing was very lavish. It was royal. It was very dignified as well. And the king and the children did not attend the funeral. Again, it was not customary for them to be present, so that's something completely normal. But they did grieve really intensely, and I just wanted to quickly mention this incredible image that was discovered fairly recently as part of a manuscript that was presented to Henry VII after the death of Elizabeth. And one of the pictures shows Henry VII actually receiving that manuscript, and he's wearing these robes of dark blue, which was the royal color of mourning. So he's wearing mourning robes, but then back behind in the corner, there is the image of a young boy crying on an empty bed. And that young boy, that red-headed boy, is Henry VIII, the future Henry VIII. He's 11 years old, and he is shown crying on the empty bed of his late mother. And this is such a powerful image because to me, the fact that it's represented, the fact that this whole image has been created and then given to Henry VII, it means that the grief of the entire royal family was well known. Elizabeth's death destroyed the royal family. It was a huge blow for them.
No, it was. I think to know so much about the fact, we know have so many sources about how Henry VII utterly broke down because of
Mm.
Elizabeth's death, which is usually an insight that we wouldn't hear. You know, if a consort died, we'd be like, yes, the monarch's very upset. Like when Anne Neville dies, we have, yes, I'm very sad that my wife died. That's how Richard III was. But we have Henry absolutely devastated. As you say, like he was absolutely crushed, heartbroken. And I think it shows how much of an impact she had made on Henry, her daughters, her sons, the court. They were devastated, and I think it just shows what kind of woman Elizabeth was.
I think she was the glue that was holding him all together.
No, completely, completely right. Does Elizabeth have a legacy? And if so, what legacy did she leave?
Well, by her very existence and her marriage to Henry, she ended the Wars of the Roses. Like her marriage ended decades of civil war, of a civil war that tore England apart. This is her biggest legacy, really. This is the role that she played for England and for the future because it changed everything. It changed everything for everyone. And something that I love is that her bloodline is still sitting on the throne today. Our current king, Charles III, is a descendant of Elizabeth through her firstborn daughter, Margaret. Elizabeth and Henry founded a dynasty, and we all know the struggles of their son, Henry VIII, to have a legitimate son, to continue his bloodline. And it didn't, but Elizabeth continued. Elizabeth's descendants never stopped sitting on the throne. And I think this is wonderful because I think she would have been appalled at her son's behavior once on the throne. And so it's only fair that her blood continues to reign, but not his.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Shambles that Henry VIII is.
Yeah. And God knows I love to study him. But yeah,
Yeah, he's all right to study, but if I hear anything nice or positive, can't speak to
but we shall not speak of him at all.
you. It doesn't come up in conversation.
Exactly.
No, he is fascinating to learn about, and I think he was had a very close relationship with Elizabeth of York. Like obviously, you said their handwriting was very similar, and there's only one reason for one reason for that.
Exactly.
Before I let you go, I like to ask my guests five fun Tudor questions. So, firstly, have you got a Tudor pet peeve?
Oh, so many. Um, I think at the moment, if I have to choose one, my pet peeve is when people fight over the internet to, air quote, defend their favorite Tudor queen against another, saying that they hate that other queen. I think most of the time it's, Anne Boleyn against Jane Seymour, but it can apply to other figures as well. And to me, I have to say, hate is such a strong word for someone who lived and died 500 years ago and whom we'll never fully know. We'll never really completely know who they were and how they thought. So I'd say that, yeah, for me, the like, oh, I hate Jane Seymour, things like this. This is my Tudor pet peeve at the moment.
No, I agree because it's coming up such a lot on TikTok at the moment, and I'm sure, as you say, you've noticed it. Why are we hating? Well, what have they done?
Exactly.
I
They
mean,
literally died 500 years ago. Let them rest.
I get nervous if I post about the Six Wives in case I get an argument in the comments about I prefer Anne Boleyn. Okay, cool.
Exactly. Oh well. Yeah, this is my pet peeve.
If you could return to any event or day in the Tudor period, when or where would it be?
I'm going to say the coronation of Henry VII because Lady Margaret Beaufort, so his mother, she is said to have cried tears and tears of relief and happiness on that day. Because after all these years fearing for his life and fighting for his very right to survive and and eventually his right to wear the crown, it was happening. He was there. He was by her side. He was in England. His son was there. His son was safe. His son was King of England, her only son, that she was devoted to. Like she had done it. At that moment, she realized she had done it and he was safe and he was king. And I think it must have been such a powerful moment, such a powerful image as well to see that frail little lady because she was quite a petite woman. Um, that frail little lady that at the same time was the strongest soul in the entire kingdom. Finally, just like break down in tears of relief and happiness. And I think I would give anything to see that.
Well, that's actually quite an interesting one because, as you say, she worked so hard to get him just back to England more than anything. It was just one
Alive.
alive, not thrown over a ship.
Exactly.
Have you got a favourite book? It can be fiction or non-fiction.
Well, this is a difficult question because my answer changes every time I read another book. So I think I'll just change the question slightly. I don't read a lot of fiction books, so it's a bit hard for me to answer that. But the latest great non-fiction book I've read was Queen James by Gareth Russell. So that's on James the First and Sixth. And it was honestly amazing. It was glorious. I loved it. And I'm also currently rereading The Plantagenets by Dan Jones, which is quite classic, really. But I read it ages ago, and I'm really enjoying it right now. I'm really enjoying diving back into it 'cause I want to become more familiar with what happened before, before the Tudors, before the Wars of the Roses, and what shaped the country and set the scene really for Henry VII. So yeah, these two at the moment, they're top of the list.
Now I'm currently reading Queen James at the moment and I'm really enjoying it. I'm about 150 in.
Ah, it's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Nice.
Um,
It really is. He really has such a way to write about history. I love it. It feels intimate and at the same time so researched. It's wonderful.
it feels a bit like a conversation with him. It's not,
Exactly.
it's not like, it's not, sometimes you get a history teacher's like, It doesn't feel like, I feel like I've asked a question and he's given me the answer in the book.
Yeah, and it feels alive, very digestible. Yeah, very good. Loved it.
I like how he does his own anecdotes like, yikes, awkward.
I know.
It's like,
I think he writes the same way that he talks.
yeah, literally. Which Tudor figure would you invite to a dinner party and why?
Now, you keep on asking me very unfair question because it's impossible to just choose one. But I think I think in honor of this podcast, I will choose Elizabeth of York just because I want to pick her brain on everything and answer all the questions that we still have about her. Did like did she think that Richard killed her brothers? Did she actually know what happened to her brothers? Did she think that they escaped? Or what would she think of Henry VIII's behavior, once on the throne? Did she know anything about her father, potentially already being married to Eleanor Butler? And how did she feel about Henry VII? And everything about her. Because there's so much we don't know because of her gender, because of her personality. She's been so sidelined from history. And there's so much I want to know. I want to give her that voice, proper five-course dinner or banquet or something like all night long. Bottomless brunch. I want a bottomless brunch with Elizabeth of York. And we stay as long as we can, as long as possible. And I want to finally give her the space to tell me everything and rant about everything. And I want to know everything.
You want everything, you need it written down, so you need to be sober enough to write it all.
Yeah.
Maybe you tape it just in case.
Yeah, maybe a recording device. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't do well with Prosecco, so recording device is good.
So if we found out everything, we need it. This this will go on Channel
Yeah,
5
exactly.
documentaries. What Elizabeth of York said.
Can you imagine though? I would absolutely love this. And even just, I don't know, like finding a long lost letter or something like this, like a new discovery of what Elizabeth thought, like a journal entry or something, a letter signed by Elizabeth. I would love that so much.
It's not impossible. We're finding things all the time. You never know.
That is true. That is very true. Fingers crossed.
Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing Queen Elizabeth of York. and informing us all what a great woman she was.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
If you enjoyed this episode and you loved all the others, please take the time to rate and review the show.